Okay, hi everybody. So we are starting a new unit of the course. We are out of deductive logic and we're starting to take a closer look at inductive logic, inductive reasoning. Now, if you remember, in an inductive argument or in inductive reasoning in general, you don't evaluate these kinds of arguments for validity and soundness. That's only for deductive arguments, right? For inductive arguments, such as arguments by analogy, causal arguments, generalizations, predictions, and arguments by authority, for those kinds of arguments, you evaluate them for strength and cogency. I think you might remember this. You had an assignment on it earlier in the semester. But that's important to know. So we're shifting our focus away from deductive reasoning and we're starting to look at inductive reasoning a little bit more closely, beginning with arguments by analogy. So, and also one good thing to remember is that generally speaking, in an inductive argument, when the premises are true, the conclusion's probably true, but not necessarily, right? You've made a decent case for your conclusion, but you haven't guaranteed it the way that you would with a good deductive argument. Okay, let's go. So analogical arguments in general, they have this basic form, right? X, and so analogical arguments are where you're comparing two or more things in order to generate your conclusion, right? So they have this basic form. Imagine that you're comparing, you want to draw a conclusion about Y, right? Whatever Y might be. You might say something like this. Well, X and Y both have attributes or features or characteristics, A, B, and C. They both have them, right? And we know that X also has this feature D, or this attribute D. So considering how much X and Y already have in common, Y probably has D as well, right? Plugging in anything that, that you want really in for X and Y. So the entity or the thing that serves as your basis of comparison is called the primary analog, right? That's the thing that you know the most about when you begin your argument. It's your basis of comparison. That's the regular everyday language, right? And the entity or thing or process being argued about in the conclusion is called the secondary analog. That's the thing that you're trying to draw a conclusion about. Excuse me. So these are best illustrated through example, which we're going to do in just a moment. But before I do that, let's talk about some useful principles for evaluating arguments by analogy. Right? So first you want to ask yourself, are the similarities cited between the primary and secondary analogs, are they relevant to the conclusion? Right? You got to focus on what you're trying to conclude here and say, and what kind of things are we drawing comparisons? What are our primary and secondary analogs? And are the things they have in common, do they have any bearing on the conclusion? Like imagine if you were to say, Bob's new car is red, compact, has leather upholstery, and gets good gas mileage. Well, Mike's new car is red, compact, has leather upholstery, and we know that, so it shares those things in common with Mike's car. So considering everything they have in common, Mike's car probably gets good gas mileage as well. Now, that's a particularly bad analogy, but I just wanted to remind you all about, what one in real life kind of looks like. So are the similarities cited between the primary and secondary analogs, are they relevant to the conclusion? Do they have any bearing on what you're trying to conclude? And the more relevant similarities there are, the stronger the argument. Notice the word strong, right? This refers to the logic of an inductive argument, right? Strength and cogency. So the more relevant similarities between the two things that you're comparing, the stronger the argument. Are there relevant disanalogies or dissimilarities between the things you're comparing? Those can serve to strengthen or to weaken the argument. The more primary analogs, which are also similar, or the more things you have as a basis for your comparison, the stronger the argument. The more diversity amongst the primary analogs, the stronger the argument. And is the conclusion too specific? The more specific the conclusion, the weaker the argument. Now, at this point, I realize since we don't have a working example going, this can only make so much sense. But these are all laid out in your book, and they're also laid out in the PowerPoint by itself. And that's what you want to refer to when you're doing these problems. So let's put it to work. So Cheryl and Denise are sisters. They're about the same age, they go to the same school, and they like the same TV programs. Well, we know that Cheryl liked the movie The Chronicles of Narnia. So considering everything they share in common, Denise is probably going to like The Chronicles of Narnia as well. So in this example, your primary analog is Cheryl. That's the person who you know the most about. That is the person who is serving as the basis of comparison for you. Right? Then notice the secondary analog is Denise, the person that's being argued about in the conclusion. Okay? So now, this is how the problems that you'll have to do are structured. So you take that original analogy and everything they have in common, everything that was listed, and now suppose that you added that they both like the fantasy genre, right? Would that strengthen the argument, weaken the argument, or have absolutely no effect on the argument, right? Well, this additional factor would strengthen the argument. And why? Because you added another relevant similarity between the primary and secondary analogs. So in addition to being around the same age and going to the same school and liking the same TV programs, now you add that, oh, and they also like the fantasy genre as well. Both of them do. So you added another relevant similarity. And why is that relevant? It's relevant to the conclusion. The conclusion is that Denise is going to like this Chronicles of Narnia movie too, which happens to be in the fantasy genre. Now suppose that you added that they both have freckles. Is that going to strengthen, weaken, or have no effect on the argument? Well, that additional factor would have no effect on the argument. Why? Because it's irrelevant to the conclusion. Freckles, them both having freckles has nothing to do with whether or not Denise is going to like the movie Chronicles of Narnia. Now suppose that you add that Denise, she doesn't usually like it when movies are made from books, and this is the case with the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a movie that was made from a book, right? Unlike Cheryl, Denise usually doesn't like it when that happens. Suppose you added that, right? Well, this additional factor would weaken the argument. Why? Because you've added a relevant disanalogy or dissimilarity between the primary and secondary analogs. So you have all this stuff they have in common, right? They're sisters, about the same age, they like the same TV shows, go to the same school, blah, 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 blah. And then you say, whoa, but Denise usually doesn't like it when movies are made from books. That's gonna mess up your argument a little bit. That's gonna make the conclusion a little less likely, which is weakening the argument, right? That is a relevant dissimilarity or disanalogy between Denise and Cheryl. Suppose you add that they both like the same movies, books, web pages, and games. There's a lot more stuff there, right? So you ask yourself, are those relevant to the conclusion? And yeah, those additional factors would strengthen the argument. Why? Because you've added more relevant similarities between Cheryl and Denise, between the primary and secondary analogs. Now suppose that you add that they have 3 other sisters who share the same similarities, and they like that Chronicles movie too. That additional factor would strengthen the argument. And why? Because you've added more primary analogs who share relevant similarities. So now it's not only Cheryl who liked Chronicles. There's 3 other sisters with the same things in common who like Chronicles. Isn't that going to make it more likely that this other sister, Denise, is going to like them too? Okay, so that would strengthen the argument. Now suppose that you change the conclusion to state that instead of Denise, so the original conclusion said Denise will probably like the movie Chronicles. Now suppose you change the conclusion to state Denise is going to most certainly, for sure, slam dunk like the movie Chronicles as well. That's going to weaken the argument. And why? Because the conclusion is more specific. You're asking more out of this form of reasoning than it rightfully should be able to handle. It's one thing to say, look, Cheryl and Denise, they have all of these things in common. All of these commonalities are relevant to the conclusion, right? And the conclusion is Denise is probably going to like this movie. If you change that conclusion, you kept all that information the same, and you change that conclusion to, oh, well, given all that stuff, Denise is going to for sure like Chronicles as well. That's going to weaken the argument. You're asking a heck of a lot from an inductive argument here, right? You don't know for certain she's going to like it, but probably that's going to be more likely. So this, changing the conclusion this way is going to weaken the argument because the conclusion's more specific. And conversely, suppose you change the conclusion to state that, there's a chance Denise will like Chronicles as well. Like before, the original conclusion was she'll probably like it. Now let's imagine that you change the conclusion to say, there's a slim chance. That's going to strengthen the argument. Why? Because the conclusion is less specific. You're asking less of this form of reasoning. So you lay down all of those similarities, and then you say, given all of that, there's a chance Denise will like it. Well, that conclusion is much more likely to follow, right? You're only asking for a chance. All right, good. Let's do one more of those. So Jenny has admired Raquel's athletic physique, and she notes that Raquel works out on a RoboFlex machine. Jenny concludes that if she buys a RoboFlex machine, she'll be able to duplicate Raquel's results. So in this case, your primary analog isn't Raquel, it's Raquel's results, right? That's the person who's serving as your basis of comparison. Your secondary analog is Jenny's anticipated results, right? The secondary analog is the one you're arguing about in the conclusion. She concludes that if she buys a RoboFlex, she'll be able to duplicate these results of Raquel's, right? So the secondary analog is Jenny's anticipated results. We're doing the same stuff we did with the last example. So imagine you added that RoboFlex recently changed its corporate headquarters from Ohio to Illinois. So you're asking yourself at this point, is that relevant to the conclusion? Does that have anything to do with whether or not Jenny's going to be able to duplicate Raquel's results on this damn machine, right? And the answer is no. There'd be no effect. Why? Because that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the conclusion. What if you add that, as it turns out, Jenny and Raquel are siblings? They're sisters, right? Well, that additional factor would strengthen the original argument, right? Why? Because you've added a relevant similarity between the primary and secondary analogs, between Raquel and Denise. And the relevant similarity is their DNA, right? DNA is a large predictor of the kind of results you get from exercise. So that would strengthen the argument. Whoa, but wait a minute. Raquel is 25 years old, but Jenny's 45. And remember, Raquel's the one who's already used the RoboFlex, and she's done really well with it. And Jenny's the one thinking about using it based on Raquel's results, but Jenny's 45. So you're asking yourself, is this... So this is a difference, right? This is a disanalogy between Raquel and Jenny. So you ask yourself, is that relevant to the conclusion? And the answer is yes, right? This additional factor would weaken the argument. Why? Because you've added a relevant disanalogy between the primary and secondary analogs. 20 years difference is a big difference in exercise land, right? So what you can do at 25 and the kind of results you can get from exercise from 25 is very different from 45. So when you add this, you make it less likely that Jenny's going to be able to duplicate Raquel's results. She's 20 years older. Jenny is 40 pounds medically overweight, but Raquel was only 10 pounds medically overweight when she started using her RoboFlex, right? This additional factor would weaken the argument. And why? Again, because you've added a relevant disanalogy between the primary and secondary analogs. It matters. Your starting point matters, right? So if Jenny's already 20 years older, and now you add that she's 40 pounds medically overweight, but Raquel was only 10 pounds medically overweight, that is a significant difference that is going to impact whether or not Jenny's able to duplicate Raquel's results. Right? So you've weakened the argument by adding this relevant disanalogy. Oh, but whenever Jenny makes up her mind to do something, she always sticks with it longer than Raquel does, meaning that Jenny's got discipline, and Raquel doesn't have nearly as much discipline as Jenny does, right? Well, that additional factor is going to strengthen the argument. Why? In this case, because you've added a relevant disanalogy that serves to make the conclusion that Jenny's going to be able to duplicate Raquel's results, it's going to be more likely, right? So remember that relevant disanalogies or dissimilarities, they can strengthen or weaken. You really got to look into it. This difference between Jenny and Raquel is going to make it more likely that Jenny can duplicate the results. Why? She has more discipline. Now, Jenny knows of 5 other women who work out on a RoboFlex, and all these women have athletic physiques just like Raquel's. So she goes out there, finds 5 other women. They all say, oh yeah, it's great, it's great, it's great, it's great, it's great, it's great. And is that going to make her conclusion more or less likely, right, that she'll be able to duplicate Raquel's results? Well, that would strengthen the argument. It's going to make the conclusion more likely. Why? Because you've added more primary analogs, right? These other 5 women serve as more primary analogs with relevant similarities. But these women are all between the ages of 24 and 26. And remember, Jenny is 40. So that additional factor is going to weaken the argument, right? Why? Because you've added a relevant disanalogy between Jenny and these new primary analogs. A couple more slides. So then Jenny discovers 4 additional women between the ages of 40 and 50 who work out on a RoboFlex, and all of these women have athletic physique. It's starting to sound like it's looking better for Jenny then, isn't it? Right? Considering that Jenny's 45. So this additional factor would strengthen the argument. Why? Because you've added more primary analogs that share relevant similarities with Jenny. Now, Jenny changes her conclusion to state that her physique will look almost as athletic as Raquel's. Maybe she won't be able to. So the original conclusion was she was going to be able to duplicate Raquel's results. Imagine she changes the conclusion to say, maybe I can't duplicate it, but I'll look almost as good as her. That is going to strengthen the argument. Why? Because you've made the conclusion less specific. You're asking for less in your conclusion. Then, imagine she changes her conclusion to state that not only will she be able to duplicate Raquel's results, she's going to look even more athletic than Raquel. Well, that additional factor would weaken the argument. Why? Because the conclusion is more specific. You're asking more of this form of reasoning, right? Which is always going to weaken the argument. So, would we cover arguments by analogy in general and evaluating strength and weakness in arguments by analogy using changing factors? And hopefully this helps you do your homework assignment because you have a couple problems just like these. Okay.